and welcome to Aspects of Writing. I'm your host, James Kelly, and my co host for today's show is Janet Corsi. The topic of the show is From Newspapers to Radio, and our guests for today's show are Hal Morris and Morgan St. James. But before we get to our guests, my pal and I would like to read a few fun quips or quotes. They are sent to us by our friend Bonnie Apple, a fellow author. And Jan, I'm going to let you read the first one.
Well, I love this, and it's befitting to everybody. Attitude is a choice. Happiness is a choice. Kindness is a choice. Giving is a choice. Respect is a choice. Whatever you choose, you makes you. Choose wisely. This is by Roy T. Bennett, and I love the way she finishes her letter with "Hug yourself today."
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
And Morgan?
Yeah, well, I'm going to read one from an author that I discovered back in the 70s,
Oh, okay.
Dr. Wayne Dwyer. And he says, you can't discover light by analyzing the darkness.
All right.
And I think that's very telling. It's
Yes.
from his book, Being in Balance.
All right. And Hal?
Well, I like the one that says, your mind is a garden, your thoughts are the seeds. You can either grow flowers or you can grow weeds.
Uh-huh.
Mostly weeds right now.
Yeah. All right. And mine is by Thomas Jefferson. On matters of style, swim with the current. On matters of principle, stand like a rock.
Wow.
All right.
All great quotes.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
She sends really nice quotes. If you are just tuning in, you're listening to Aspects of Writing with me, your host, James Kelly. Our guests are Morgan St. James and Hal Morris. And the topic of the show is From Newspapers to Radio. And Morgan, please introduce Hal.
Okay, well, Hal has done so few things in his life that actually I think I have to read about what Hal's done. Okay? Hal spent 2 decades at Times Mirror in Los Angeles and at the Los Angeles Times and Los Angeles Mirror. He wrote early bylines as a full-time editorial staffer at the Times. He was a campus correspondent at the Los Angeles City College and a frequent contributor to the Times' glossy Sunday home magazine, writing mostly about plants and flowers. Hal was one of the first 9 editorial people hired when the Los Angeles Mirror started. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And over the years, Hal wrote 4 different columns for the Mirror, including one as a foreign correspondent from the Far East while he was in the Army. He was writing for Stars and Stripes as well. His first Mirror column was a daily man on the street interviewing 5 people on topics of the day and then snapping a photo of each. Others dealt with the latest recorded music, with Off the Record, and the business end of the entertainment industry. Show Biz was the name of that column. Back in the newsroom, he worked in every department except sports. How come no sports?
I don't know. They didn't like baseball, I guess. That was my forte.
Oh.
What do they know?
Yeah.
That included editing copy at the main copy desk and later in what was then called the women's department with a separate daily multi-page section plus a Thursday food section. Hal, did you write as a man or a woman for that?
That was all women. I was the only...
No, but I mean, did you pretend to be a woman, or did
Well,
you know?
my voice wasn't high enough.
Okay. Hal also wrote for the entertainment pages, focusing on music, covering the Hollywood Bowl, the Hollywood Palladium, and the Shrine Auditorium. In those days, reviews appeared in the next morning's newspaper. Eventually, he was selected to be the news editor in the business news section. Linked to that was the editor of Special Sections, a tabloid supplement. There were about 10 of those every year for readers. All of those experiences helped in later years as a freelancer, writing mainly for business publications. Hal spent 4 years producing a live weekly radio show on a top Los Angeles station. interviewing major names in the entertainment business, from Gregory Peck to 20th Century Fox producers. Over the years, he's written more than 1,000 articles for various publications, ranging as far wide as from Reader's Digest to USA Today. Well, his focus today is on the web, where since 2006, Hal has written grumpyeditor.com. And if you would like a rundown of what's happened that week, with sometimes a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, check it out on the web, grumpyeditor.com.
All right. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Aspects of Writing with me, your host, James Kelly, and my co-host is Janet Coursey. Our guests are Morgan St. James and Hal Morris. The topic of the show is the topic of the show is from, what did we say it was, guys? From newspapers to radio. There we go.
Yeah.
Didn't
Right.
change something in the script. Our next guest is Morgan St. James. And Jan, I'm going to let you introduce Morgan.
It is always an honor and a privilege to be with you.
I'll pay you later.
Yeah. You already have. I got my last 2 books for free. You write the Silver Sister Mysteries along with your sister, and you have quite a legacy of writing. And why don't you tell us how you began doing this? Because I find that so interesting to take you from where you started to where you are now. So give us
Yeah, well,
insight.
you know, I call myself an accidental writer because I never started out to be a writer. And in fact, I have to put this little plug in. I publish a quarterly writers online magazine, which is free, Writers Tricks of the Trade. And you can find it at writerstricksofthetrade.blogspot.com. And the reason I mention that is that in the spring issue, which comes out on the 15th, I talk about how I got started in writing.
Oh, okay.
And the illustration on that page is the very first thing I ever had published in a major magazine.
Oh.
Believe it or not, I kept it.
Good for you.
This goes back to the 70s when I didn't even write under my middle name. But I was an interior designer, and my partner and I had a design studio. Where else but in Studio City, California,
Yeah.
on Ventura. And there was a very prestigious designers magazine at that time, in fact, the most prestigious one on the West Coast, a Slick, called Designers West. And we had done a floor that was fascinating. It was done from packing crates. And, you know, you'd assume something like that would be funky.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. It was the most elegant, most gorgeous floor you could imagine because there were so many different kinds of woods in these crates.
Yeah.
Some of them were so exotic they were actually unidentifiable.
Huh.
Nobody knew what they were, but they were gorgeous. And we had the entire floor done custom milled, custom stained, custom sealed. And Designers West wanted us to do an article on it. Well, it was a techie magazine, basically, for interior designers and people in the architectural trade. So, my God, what could be better? You know, we'd have this wonderful coverage in a magazine that was going all over, that would talk about our work and our studio.
Right.
And we said, yeah, we're on, you know, we'll do it. And they sent out the photographers, and they photographed my partner Carol and I sitting on crates on the empty floor, and the whole thing was going great until a couple of nights before our article was due.
What
we didn't
happened?
have anything
Oh.
because we came to the horrible realization that we weren't writers. And, you know, we're going, oh my God, they're going to have blank pages with that picture saying this is where the article was supposed to be. And, you know, we're going to be a pariah in the industry. So we sat around my house in the evening, and we were drinking wine and commiserating. And the more wine we drank, the more creative we got. And finally we said, the hell with a techie article. Let's do something fun. Let's make it a noir mystery. Like, we only had one page to work with, but let's make it a noir mystery. Like, you know, combing the waterfronts, and, you know, we're in the tone of Boston Blackie. So we started out with something like, you know, we were sitting in our design studio when the telephone rang.
Yeah,
Just
right.
the normal opening. Anyway, we finished it up. We submitted it to the editor, and we thought, oh, she is going to call us ranting and raving. But at least we will have fulfilled what we said.
Right.
We
You
would.
That's
wrote
right.
the article.
She called us. She was laughing. And we didn't know if that was good or bad. And she said, I absolutely love it. We're going to run
Uh-huh.
it. We never had anything like this. They ran it. It got very good response. And after that, she wanted to know if we wanted to write more articles for them. My God, when I walked into a supermarket and picked up that magazine off the rack and saw my article in it, I was
Oh.
a writer.
Yeah,
That's
that-
right.
that'll
That's
do it.
Right.
Yeah, and my partner Carol, she was also an actress, and she said, "Nah, I don't want to write anymore. You know, that one was enough." I said, "I'll do it." And I
Uh-huh.
went on. I wrote several more articles for Designers West magazine. In fact, I even had the cover of one issue. And I went on to write articles about different topics for different publications. And eventually, 20 years later, I
Yeah.
segued into writing fiction.
Well, it sounds like it woke up the writer in you. I think the writer
Yes.
was always there, of course, and
Yeah.
you just weren't aware of how talented.
Well, you know, I never had any formal writing classes in school. And the only writing class that I ever took was at UCLA for travel writing by a very prolific LA Times travel writer.
Mm,
And he bred everything out of me. I wound up hating travel writing.
yeah.
And that was the only formal class in a school that I ever did. However, I have to say, I've taken many, many workshops at conferences
Mhm.
and evolved to the point where I give workshops in conferences.
Uh-huh.
But I always feel that if you can learn from somebody who's actively working in a field, then you learn the real ins and outs of things.
Yes.
Well, and this is a constantly changing industry too. I mean,
Yes.
you were talking about digital publishing a while ago, and 10 years ago you wouldn't even mention a digital magazine.
No.
No.
So we're in an industry that is always, we got to stay up on the latest thing that's going on in the industry.
Yeah. What worked yesterday doesn't work today.
That's right. Yeah. All right. So where else can we find your books?
My books are on Amazon, all of my 16 books.
Yes.
And they're on just about every online bookseller.
Okay.
And if you go to Amazon and Google my name or search my name, it will come up with just about every title that they have of mine. And
Okay.
I write funny crime fiction, but I've also written 2 memoirs for amazing women who are abuse survivors. Those are
Yes.
the books right there, No More Crying Angels and Incest, Murder, and a Miracle. And through writing those, we've gotten awards. Incest, Murder, and a Miracle is under option to Sony Pictures. And I have become an advocate for promoting the recognition and prevention of domestic abuse.
It's amazing how rampant it really is in this country, and people aren't aware
Right.
because it's almost like cancer. It's a silent killer.
Yes, that's true. And you know, Incest, Murder, and a Miracle, when Cheryl Cuccio was arrested for her father's murder, it was the first time that the word incest had ever been used in a newspaper headline. And that
Ah,
was 1986.
that's sad.
Now Paul Atreides, I believe.
No, I don't.
Oh, you don't? Okay. Well, he runs the Henderson
Oh,
Writers
yes, Paul. I thought you said Paula.
Group. No,
And
Paul
I'm trying
Atreides.
to picture Paula.
No. Well,
Yes, I do know Paul.
Paul was just on our show. We actually did a show on abuse, but it was on male abuse. And did you know
Yes.
there's more cases of male abuse than there is female abuse?
Yes, actually, I did some research for Cheryl when she gives her talks, and I gave her the stats on how many males are abused that she can use in her talks.
hmm Yeah. So anyway, we're going to move on because we're talking about
Right,
from
publications.
newspapers to
Publication.
radio. All right. I'm going to try and read this. I had eye surgery, so it's a little difficult, but I'm going to get through this. Again, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Aspects of Writing with me, your host, James Kelly, and my co-host is Janet Corsi. Our guests are Morgan St. James and Hal Morris. And the topic of the show is From Newspapers to Radio. Hal tells the story of working in Los Angeles in the highly competitive city of L.A., then 5 daily newspapers. The Mirror utilized a cruise car in which a Ford with a reporter photographer team started at 5 in the morning, monitored police radio calls while driving around the Hollywood and Beverly Hills area. This also included dropping into LAPD's Hollywood station to see who was arrested during the night. Famous names often were locked up, thus making interesting stories. Vehicles often were mistaken as a detective's car since it had 2 antennas. Direct radio communications. I can't even imagine that today.
And it had
Yeah.
a flashing red light in the rear view window.
Oh.
Rear window.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And then one time in Beverly Hills, the police received a call about a shooting at a Swank apartment complex. You got there ahead of the police unit, opened the front door, and stumbled over a dead body.
Yeah, that was in Beverly Hills, early in the morning.
So what happened when you got there first, and then you opened that door? How did the police say anything about you going into the building?
No, they were rather quiet.
Oh yeah. So was there a lot of media press about that, as far as you getting there first, or?
Well, in those days, obviously, we had the story first. That is the L.A. Mirror, and it was a very competitive town at that time. Now everything is rather slow and sluggish. If a event happens on a Wednesday, you're lucky to see it in the paper by Friday. And although things are somewhat different now, I noticed this morning I heard on radio news, something that I already read in the paper. So now what's happening, the radio is coming up behind the print version.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. I think such a huge difference in the way we write things today. When you started out, there was no digital at all, and it was probably just the typewriters when you were typing everything
Yeah,
in.
there was a lot of noise in the newsroom.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
had-
Those were manual typewriters,
Yeah.
weren't they?
Yeah.
Not even
Yeah.
electric.
Yeah.
Actually,
yeah.
they were manual, yes. And when you have 20 or 30 going at the deadline time, it's very noisy. Now, when you go into a newsroom at a newspaper, it's very quiet, and they have carpet on the floor.
Ah,
we didn't have carpet on the floor.
No.
yeah. So even when it comes to writing magazine articles, it's a lot different as well. When you submitted your first article, how did you submit it, Morgan?
My first article, well, that was the first article was the one that we were
Right,
approached
but did
on.
you
But then
mail
I-
it, or how did you submit it to them?
Typewritten.
So you took it to them, or you mailed it to them, or?
We took it to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And then in later years, when I was writing for some other publications, for example, my mother had suffered many strokes. And I realized how little research there was available, how little guidelines, because there was some on Alzheimer's, but very little on how to handle somebody with dementia that didn't have Alzheimer's. And so I contacted a magazine in Philadelphia. It was a Sunday magazine from newspaper with the query as to whether they would be interested in an article about how to help people who had dementia from non-Alzheimer's reasons. And they got back to me, which in this day and age, you're lucky if you get anything back.
Yes.
But they got back to me right away after receiving the query. And I sent it by mail, by snail mail, because email was sort of in its infancy then.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they got back to me right away and they said, "Oh my God, this is wonderful. We have a health issue coming up and we would love your article. And here's how much we'll pay you for it. And here's how many words we want." And that was my first publication in Inside Magazine. And then they came to me afterwards with topics that they would like me to write about, and I wrote more articles for them.
Oh.
So when you started writing for newspapers and magazines, how did that come about?
How did I come about writing?
Yeah,
for-
that you started writing for newspaper and magazines.
Well, after I left the Mirror, I did a lot of writing for a number of publications. some on a very regular basis, like contributor to the business section of the Christian Science Monitor, and then which is now only printed weekly, and also for the Daily American Banker, which is still in business. I was their West Coast correspondent, and then I was California editor of Pacific Banker and Business. The thrust was in business, especially banking, and which later led into me becoming a director of a community bank in the LA area. So you see, one thing leads to
another.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
How did you first get those jobs?
Well, those days they were looking for correspondents and someone who could contribute, could write fast, send it in.
So you applied.
Pardon me?
You applied for the job.
Yeah, I would say that. Sometimes I was referred, and it was a very interesting period. It kept me very busy. I carried a briefcase at one time that was very heavy with a lot of my notes and whatnot.
Yeah.
That I actually got a hernia. And
Oh my God.
I had to go to the hospital. So beware.
People don't realize that can happen. Aren't you glad we have digital today?
Yeah, right.
Now you just carry a flash drive. So
Right. Right.
No hernias there.
no hernias
You know,
there.
there's relating to jobs these days. Since a lot of news people are out of work, newsroom people are out of work. As a matter of fact, the median pay now is only about $40,000, $41,000 a year, and that comes down to about $20 an hour.
And that's for the newspaper writer, right?
That's
Or editor.
reporters, correspondents, broadcast
Oh.
news analysts, that kind of thing.
Are you talking about across all genres, whether it be newspaper, radio, television?
Well, this is mainly print news.
Okay, print.
Yeah, and a lot of them require a bachelor degree. That's important these days.
Hmm.
And the official tally of jobs in print is about 50,000. That's quite a decline from early days. In fact, newsroom employment dropped nearly a quarter in less than 10 years, with the greatest decline in newspapers.
And that's the reason is there not as many newspapers in print, not as many magazines in print.
That's right.
You know, I think there's another reason too, is that there's so much free news available online.
Yeah.
That so many of those stories aren't vetted. They're not done professionally.
Right.
If you read through them, there are grammatical errors, there are spelling errors, there are words missing.
Yes.
But it's news, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And therefore, the demand for a skilled reporter has gone down because the readership has gone down.
And I think that's the one thing that's changed really dramatically is the fact that everything had to be edited. You just didn't put anything out. Every word had to be spelled correctly. The syntax was important. Today, it's like you said, now they're just putting the news out there. You're going to find errors in all kinds. Even on online magazines, you're going to find a lot of
Oh,
problems.
yeah.
You know?
I find them all the time.
Yeah.
Of course, I scrutinize, you know.
Yeah.
But
Let me tell you how this contrasts with days of yesteryear. When a reporter wrote some copy, it would go to the city desk, where the city editor would look it over and made a few notations or corrections. Then it would go to the copy desk, where veteran copywriters would look at it and make additional corrections, adjust words, question the writer, and from there it would go to the composing room. And it wasn't unusual even to see someone from the proofroom in the adjoining the composing room to come into the editorial department with a question relating to something that was in the copy.
Yeah.
So there were several stages that copy went through before it got into print, and rather on the presses.
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, even in publishing, just a few years ago, in '95, when I did my first book, that changed dramatically too. You used to send your work in a negative, and then they'd put that on a big sheet, and you'd have all eight pages on one negative, and then they did the editing. Well, look, if there was a mistake, they would go in with something and just like erase it or mark it out. If there was one error on that page, though, they had to do the whole sheet.
No.
Yeah,
That
so
sounds like what it was like to be a legal secretary before, you could do it on a computer, on any brief, anything like that. If there was one error, you had to retype the whole page because you couldn't erase.
right.
Right.
And it was quite costly too if you were to call them and tell them, if the sheets were already made. I want to also ask, because you were in radio. When you were in radio, did you use any kind of notes or bullet points or script?
Well, I had notes for introducing somebody, but it was everything was off the cuff in the interview.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's what made it interesting.
Yeah.
You mentioned radio. I happened to find on the web this week there's a job opening in San Francisco.
Okay.
But look at how much work is involved in this. The
Okay.
person has to be responsible for writing on-air news copy,
Okay.
then writing and editing newscasts -wire copy for broadcast.
Mm-hmm.
Then also would be doing interviewing newsmakers and also fact-checking news stories and researching news topics, plus other duties as required by management. Now, in addition, qualifications: minimum of 3+ years news editing, writing experience, must be computer literate and have excellent writing skills. Position requires proficiency in editing and packaging news sound and interviews. I don't know what news sound is. Must work well under breaking news and deadline pressure. Knowledge of the broadcast area and station demographics is essential, and 4-year degree in journalism preferred. And with all that, the most important thing, there's no indication what the pay is.
Right, which is probably
Yeah.
what you said.
Yeah.
Probably around 40, maybe 50,000 a year.
Well, that was for.
Well, I know it's for
print.
newspaper, but
Yeah,
I can almost assure you it's about the same.
Yeah,
Interestingly enough, that's what it takes to put this show together as well.
yeah.
There's one person who does all the research. There's one person who does all the
Yeah.
writing.
Yeah.
Right? So I can totally relate to what you just said.
So when are you applying?
Right.
I don't have the degree they're asking for in journalism, so
Well, education degree is okay.
yeah.
Also, English is all right. But there's one other thing I'd like to bring out. And since I covered broadcasting, there in print, there's a freelance beauty writer also in San Francisco.
Okay.
And listen to what this is. You'll be interested in this. Nathan. Collective, I won't mention the outfit. But anyway, they're looking for a freelance writer to do articles on makeup, hair, nails, fashion, and other beauty-oriented content. And responsibilities are write articles based on article spec, whatever that is. Work will be submitted via our online writing platform, so you don't get to see the editor. Article assignments can range from 4 to 10 articles per week.
Wow.
Oh, my God.
I emphasize per week. All facts should be credited and sourced. Work should be free of spelling and grammar errors, lack of plagiarism, and be factually accurate. Now, the requirements are a bachelor's degree in English, experience writing and covering beauty topics, operate well with deadlines, strong written and digital communication skills. Again, no pay indication.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you get all the free beauty products.
Right. Yeah.
With having to write that much, though, or the possibility of
Oh.
having to write that much, it better not be more than a paragraph at a pop.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Because,
Well,
Wow.
let's not say that's crazy. That's not crazy if quality doesn't matter.
Right.
If
Yeah.
you want quality pieces,
Mhm.
it'd be pretty hard to churn
To
those
do it.
all out
Yeah.
with all the other things you're supposed to do along with it.
You know,
Yeah.
that's interesting that you're saying that too, because I think a
Yeah.
lot of people who've never written before don't understand what it takes to not write a book, but you've actually worked on a couple of memoirs.
Yes.
And I don't think people understand how long it takes to do that and what it takes to do that and the
Oh, yeah.
rewrites involved in that.
We went through so many on both of those books. And then I also ghost wrote with Denny Griffin another memoir.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not only, well, I want to tell my story, I've got a story to tell. It's how do you arrange it? Do you do it
Right.
in chronological order? Do you do it in flashback order? Do you do it in such a way that you want to grab the reader in the beginning and then take them through a certain thing? And for instance, in Incest, Murder, and a Miracle, we actually did work from somewhat of a loose outline on that one. I usually don't work from a formal outline. We rearranged that outline so many times that if we had been back in the day when you didn't have computers, you would have had cut and paste all over the place.
Yeah.
And I mean, we finally got it into the flow that we wanted. And then there was another problem, is that there were two people telling the story,
Yeah.
Cheryl
Yeah.
Cuccio and Rob Cuccio.
Yeah.
And as you know, two people will never have exactly the same
thing to
viewpoint
say.
on something.
But you know, even
Yeah.
one person, if you sit down and do a session with someone and you record the session, they're going to say one thing one time, and when you go back and later on pick up or talk about something
Right.
else in there, it reminds them of something. They may not say exactly the same thing
Sure.
the second time, and that's
Right.
just human nature. We don't recall. We don't have
No.
complete and total recall.
Right.
We just
Right.
don't
Well,
work
we
that
had
way.
some fun with this. We decided to take some of the chapters and have them alternate between Cheryl and Rob, with them both talking about essentially the same
Same
thing.
thing.
How
Yeah.
did she see it? How did he see it?
Uh-huh.
And the readers really liked that. But, when we were pitching it to agents, how are readers going to relate to that?
Yeah.
You know?
How are they going to
And,
know?
oh my God, it's two genres. What do we do with it?
Uh-huh.
And the proof is in the pudding. It's under option to Sony Pictures.
Right.
Yeah.
So what about
Yeah.
the other book? How did that one?
Oh,
how did you handle that one?
No More Crying Angels. This, Bella, you would never believe that one person who at the time we were starting to do this was in her early 40s, lived so many lives.
Yeah.
When I first saw her bullet points, I thought this woman has to be in her 70s to have experienced this. And the project was brought to me by the other co-author, Dennis N. Griffin, who felt he needed a female co-author on it to digest some of the emotions of the abuse and the, what she went through. And when I met Bella, I was floored when she came to Las Vegas to do some promo stuff. I mean, I'd seen pictures of her, but when you see pictures and you see the person in person,
Right.
it's a
It's
whole
different.
different thing.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, here comes this beautiful 5'10" woman who could have been played by Angelina Jolie.
Ah.
And this is no 40-year-old woman. I mean, a 70-year-old
70-year-old
woman.
woman.
She went through all these things in such a short span of time. And by the way, with Bella, there's going to be another book because the story isn't over yet.
Yeah.
Wow.
She just testified before the Oregon State Legislature on the need for revising their mental health programs.
Mhm.
And she was sponsored by the senator and the representative from her area. And I am the one that made the contact to them that got their attention, that made them contact Bella to be their one person who was not a doctor or psychiatrist or law enforcement in this testimony.
Mhm.
Well, thank you, Morgan.
Yeah.
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 Well, so how long did it take you to write those books?
Each of them about a year and a half.
Really?
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
But now on the one with Bella, I was working with the second co-author, Dennis N. Griffin, who's a true crime author and historian. And on the one with Cheryl and Rob, they were very proactive, and they would submit to me everything that I asked for. Whereas sometimes you have to really pull the information out
From
of
someone,
somebody.
yeah.
Yeah.
But they gave me a lot of meat to work with so
Mm-hmm.
that, my job wasn't as difficult, although it was hard to organize it into
I think that's
a
the hardest
format.
thing in ghostwriting is organizing it.
Yes.
Because it is people do go off on tangents or they do go back to something you talked about earlier, and you've got to cut and paste, as you said.
Yes,
you
yes.
gotta go
And I
back.
will say one thing, and you probably know this too, is that when you're working with projects like this, where people have gone to hell and back, you have to be living in their heads while you're writing it.
Absolutely, I agree
And
with
it
that.
is painful because you're reliving what they went through.
Mhm.
And I can't tell you how many times on both of those books I sat there at the computer in tears.
Yeah. Well, I've written a few myself, and each one's been different, by the way. For
Yes.
me, they've been different. One is, like you said, there was a husband and wife. I finally just had the husband just write his own chapter. And then, and I didn't want him to touch what she had said for the reason you said, because his perspective was different than hers. And since this was her book and it was from her perspective, I thought that's all we need right now.
Yeah.
And then the other one came to me written, but loosely written, and that was almost as difficult to weed through. When you're trying to formulate.
Right. Well, it's interesting. Cheryl and Rob thought they had a book, and they did submit a whole thing to me that they had actually tried to pitch to a publisher. And as I said, all the meat was there.
Right.
Some of it needed to be drawn out. Some of it needed to be correlated.
Right.
Why did this relate to this? And what did you think when that happened? And what was your reaction to this? And can you give me more on that? But it was a good example of when somebody who hasn't done writing is very prolific, is able to express what they want to say, but it is not in a publishable form.
That was what I was
Yeah.
getting at. When someone hasn't written something, they really don't have a clue as to what goes into the project.
Right.
The thought, because a lot of times it's just sitting around thinking, like, what do I do with this, or what do I do with that, or how do I handle this? Do I need to research this? Do I need to go back and look at this a little closer? And and I don't think, they think, well, you just wrote this. No, there was a lot that goes into a page.
Right, right. And I will say something is that both Bella and Cheryl and Rob learned a lot about writing by our doing the projects.
But they worked with you on the
yes,
project.
yes.
Yeah.
It was like I was their coach
Right.
as we were going along. And I would say at this point in time that, they're good writers. They know how to express themselves. They still probably need the help pulling the projects together and so on.
Mhm.
But the difference in what they were submitting toward the end of the book and what the beginning was very discernible. You could really
Yeah.
see the difference in how
The
they'd
growth.
grown.
Yeah.
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 With Cheryl and Rob, though, there were newspaper articles written
Oh,
about what was
God.
going on. Was there ever a conflict or a feeling of maybe plagiarism, or were you able to take excerpts and induct into the book, or how did you handle that?
Well, we used some of the newspaper articles, but the thing that was most significant was that in 1989, a New York Times reporter wrote a book about Cheryl's case. Now, she had only interviewed Cheryl once, a distraught 16-year-old who was so traumatized she didn't even remember having talked to this reporter.
Oh, my heavens.
And she wrote a whole book about it, and she fabricated, and she
Yeah.
theorized, and she painted Cheryl as a person that she wasn't. And it was so painful to Cheryl to see that book when she was 19 years old that she was only able to read up to page 27.
So basically, the author sensationalized it.
She not only sensationalized it, she presented it as though Cheryl had told her all those things. She
Oh.
presented it as reality. And so we did take a few sections of that book, and we felt we were very justified in doing it
Mhm.
and taking just not big sections, but taking a small section and then commenting on what the reality was.
Uh-huh.
Like she said that Cheryl spent hours a day on the telephone with her girlfriends discussing clothes and boys and music. And, she painted her out, because Cheryl had been a cheerleader, she painted her out as being a real flighty bimbo. And Cheryl said, yeah, sure, I did that. While I took care of the house, helped raise my sister, got nailed by my father 3 times a day, was responsible for the shopping, and she itemized all the things that her day consisted of. And she said, of course I stayed on the phone for hours with my girlfriends.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I don't know where we got
Yeah.
off on this topic.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. I think it was important to talk about, because even when it comes to writing newspaper articles, you read a 300 word or a 700 word article even, and you're thinking, how long did it take them to write that?
A long time.
And there's a lot of thought that goes into it, and a lot of research, and I don't think just anybody can do it. I think you have to have a knack for it.
Mhm.
I don't think I could write for newspapers. I'll just be honest, because I'm not concise enough. I'm too wordy. I like to explain things.
Well, you know what? A very interesting part of it is the difference between writing for publications and writing fiction or nonfiction books. And I rapidly learned that when my sister and I wrote our first Silver Sisters mystery, A Corpse in the Soup, because we both came from the publication side.
Uh-huh.
You use information dumps in publication because you've only got this much to work with. You don't have pages and pages and pages where you can develop a thing out. So it's not at all unusual to have an information dump where you get a whole bunch of information into one small paragraph. And that's where you have to learn to really write
To
tight.
be concise.
Yeah.
But so we did that in our first book, and we had all these information dumps. And that was one of the first critiques was, you can't do information dumps in fiction. So there's, where the two forms of writing are really not the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even when it comes to the radio, it's interesting. We were talking a while ago. I asked you if you did a script when you did your show. When I started out with this show, it's been about 7.5 years now. One of my very first guests had been in radio for 10 years and had been in Hollywood for 40 years as a director. And when he came in, I've told the story on the air before, but I'll say it again. I had a script. The reason I have a script, just so the listeners know, isn't so much that we go by it. We're not going by it now.
Right.
But it's something to go back to. It's something to look at, to give us a fixed point to go to when we go off on our tangents, and can draw us back in, and we'll know where we are. Well, I didn't do that the first show, and I literally hyperventilated. But we didn't videotape it, so no one saw me hyperventilating. Thank God. But, and I happened to have the right guest who knew me and saw it. And so he would start talking and covering for me while I, regained my composure. And then we'd get going, and I'd get nervous again, and I'd start talking. And that went on the whole show. And after that first show, I said, I'm not doing this. There's no way I'm doing radio.
Yeah.
So they called me into the next day. They had listened to it. And they go, oh, that was a good show. And I'm going, good show? What do you mean good show? And then, so anyway, I told them what happened. They go, why are you so nervous? You did fine. And they said, why don't you try bullet points? So the second show, I did bullet points. That didn't work for me either, because I needed, until I had that routine down, like welcome to Aspects of Writing, I'm your host. Until you have all that down in your mind, I'm not an actor. I can't memorize that well. I needed to have that script. Now it's a crutch, I admit it. It's just there. I half the time don't even look at it. I know verbatim what I'm going to say. But it's just something to go back to. So that guest that was on my show, when I handed him the script, he said, what is this SH, blah, blah, blah. And I said, it's the show. It's the script. It's not bullet points. It tells us what we're going to be, little quotes and stuff like that. And he took it and he threw it across the conference table. We were in the conference where I used to do a conference before we would do the show. And there was a guest there, Judy McFadden.
Oh, I know Judy.
Yeah, Judy. I just spoke to her
Love
last
her.
week. Judy was there, first time ever on the radio. It was her first book. And he slung it across there. She had gotten there first, and we were having a great time. And it scared her. And I looked at him, and I realized poor Judy was probably horrified because she'd never done radio before.
Right.
So I said to this person, I said, just so you know, this is my show. And I know what you've done on your show. But on my show, this is the way we do it. and you're more than welcome to get up and leave. We don't need you. And I could see Judy's face about
Oh.
freezing because Judy and I can handle this.
Oh, I can picture her.
She's going,
I can
"Oh,
picture
no."
her
And she's
doing
going,
that.
what? Like she's listening. She's
She's
like,
like,
we can't. No, and I said, so we'll be just fine without you. Well, then I don't remember what he said next, but whatever it was, she starts in and she starts defending me. Thank goodness we weren't on the air yet. So she starts defending me, and they're going back and forth. And finally, I said, you guys, if we're going to do this, we got to go to the studio. It's about time to go on the air. Well, their little bickering continued on the air, but it was very minor. It was really kind of cute. And I dubbed them yin and yang from
Yeah.
that point forward. They became best buds. I mean, truly.
Yes.
I felt if he had stayed alive, she would have been his next wife,
Yeah.
especially if she had moved to Ohio. But anyway, the thing is that from that, Don stayed. He was on my show several times, and he ended up getting his own radio show. And do you know that he's scripted?
Yeah.
Well,
Because he found that it's easy when you do a script because
Yes.
you can't lose your place. You can't really,
right.
not like right now we're just talking off the top of our head, but I know what I'm going to have to go back to in a minute. And that's why I script the show. And I found a lot of people who've done radio, and I'm not talking about radio hosts themselves, I'm talking about authors, feel the same way. They'll come in and they'll say, why do I need this? But then after it's over, they're so glad that we did have a script.
Well, you know,
Yes.
I have something to add to that, James. You know, I did the Writer's Tricks of the Trade podcast for a
Right.
year and a half with Denny Griffin and Eric James Miller.
Right.
And we started out, and Denny had done a lot of podcasts on true crime. He had 2 or 3 different shows, and he was the one that dragged me into Writer's Tricks of the Trade because he said,
Uh-huh.
hey, I pay for the time. Why don't we do a show?
Right.
Almost like Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney.
Uh-huh.
We've got a stage, I dance, you sing,
right,
let's
exactly.
do it.
Uh-huh.
And the first couple of shows we did free speaking without a script.
Mhm.
And it was almost the same sort of situation. One of the things that I found was that it also depended on who was your guest, because without a script, some guests will take off and you can't get a word in edgewise.
Yeah, it's
you
very
can't
difficult to
get it
stop them.
back to what you wanted the show to be because they're off and running, and heaven forbid you try to interrupt them.
Right.
And you don't want to interrupt them because you don't want to look like you're not a competent
You're controlling.
host.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So then we went to the bullet points and we went to the script. So you are
Yeah.
not unique.
Yeah. But you
You're the
know,
leader.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you say, but even when you have a script, there are
Oh,
some
yeah.
people who will try and take
Well,
control.
we know one that
So,
does
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that can happen anyway. It's funny too because when I have meetings for different things we're doing, and they'll say to me, I'm very good at interrupting. And then they'll say, "Why did you do that?" And I go, "I think it's the radio me coming out. You know how it's like I think you've said enough. Now let's go to the
Right. On to the next thing.
I'd like to mention something about interviews. When I was doing the radio show, I had the Ritz Brothers on. Do you remember the Ritz Brothers?
I'm not
They were very
offhand. No.
popular in movies way back when, but they were characters, and they tried to throw me a curve, a big curve. I would ask them a question, and one of them would answer in one word,
Oh, God.
Oh wow.
Oh, no.
and then I asked the next question, one word answer.
Oh, no.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, no.
The interviewer's nightmare.
I think that was the shortest interview. I think it lasted 5 minutes.
Oh,
Well, I have to tell you, the biggest thing that ever threw me off is I had a guest on, also an author whom you know, Stephen Murray.
Oh, yeah.
His was his first show, and then we had another guest on who was not very pleasant. And I didn't know why he was irritated, except I think he wanted to be on the show by himself, and we had
Yeah.
Stephen on
Didn't
with
want
him.
to share.
Right.
right.
So he did something that I've never had happen before or since. We were live at that time on the air with KLAV, and we took phone calls. And I remember this person someone called in, which I found out later on was his daughter,
Uh-huh.
and she had asked a question which I had not read his book. I'm going to be honest with you. I interview so many people, I don't have time to read every book. So I think that bothered him as well. So anyway, what happened is that he had his daughter ask a question, and we're trying to get him to answer it. He's trying to see what we're going to say. I just playing along. I don't know that the question she asked has nothing to do with his book.
Huh.
It was about a bell that did not exist in his book. And he went on for like 10 minutes about this thing. And I was trying to figure out, why did he do this and what is he trying to do? I finally figured out it's not in his book as we were going along. So anyway, that was the biggest throw I've ever had in a show. It's like I didn't know what to do because he finally admitted it's not in the book. I'm thinking, then why did your daughter call and why are we talking about this on the air? You know,
Yeah.
but it's interesting what you have to go through in radio. You know, and the guests can throw you if you don't know what they're about. That's one reason I like to talk to a guest before I ever go on the air or get to know something about them. Now, hell, I had met you before because Morgan's been on the show and
Yeah.
you came with her to the studio. But I usually try to get to know something about that person before we go on the air.
Yeah, it really helps.
Yeah, and a lot of PR people don't understand why we do that, but it's because it gives us some insight as to how they're going to perform as far as talking and, you know, what questions we might want to ask them. I love history about someone. I don't like just knowing that you've written something. I like to know who you are, where
Yeah.
you're from, what you did to get to that point.
Well, you can get a broader spectrum that way too.
Yeah, and you know, and like this show is to encourage people to pursue their dreams as a writer. So I think the idea behind that is to let people know that every walk of life can write a book, or anyone from any walk of life can write an article. It's like you said, they do have to perfect it. They have to learn how to compartmentalize, like you were talking about
Yeah.
earlier. If you're writing for newspaper or magazines, or if you're writing a novel, you need to know how to elaborate or use your imagination.
I must say that I don't tout it because it's way back in history, but years ago I did write a book.
Oh, you did?
I didn't know that.
I ghosted a book.
Okay.
There was a professor of geology, a college professor of geology, that wanted someone to compile some information and put it in book form. And so the name of the book was Geological Surveys in Southern California.
Wow,
Okay.
that's
That was a-
scintillating.
Oh, I can't wait to read that one.
A real grabber. So anyway, I don't know what I probably sold about 6 books. But,
Well, you did okay.
Unlike Morgan's efforts.
Yeah. Well, you know, and I think a lot of times people don't realize that they actually are a writer before they become an author. We have a co-host on other shows. She had to write reports, but she also had to write for magazines and stuff, or reports for doctors and stuff that were in printed brochures. So she was really writing before she ever became a novelist, and she probably honed her skills that way, if you think about it. And then we had Scott Decker on, who was who worked for the FBI. You know, they have to write huge reports for every incident they're involved in. And when he wrote his book, I'm sure he was very well, polished by that time.
Yeah.
So we are writers when we're doing things throughout our life and don't even realize it.
Sure. My sister was a journalist, my sister co-author on the Silver Sisters. And she was a journalist. She was a political print specialist. She produced print materials for many gubernatorial races, for senators, for things like that. She also had, when she lived in Juneau, Alaska, she had a 5-minute spot on the news every night.
Yeah.
So she was a broadcaster. She put in other period of time, she put together and produced commercials for cable TV.
Mm-hmm.
So, she had that varied background too. And we write in totally different ways. And I'm the fast writer. I just churn things out. And she's also a trained editor. So she massages every word.
Yeah.
And it might take me an hour and a half to write a chapter and take her 3 days to edit it.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. You're both so different.
Yes.
And
well,
that,
you've met
I've
my
met you. She's been
sister.
on our show.
Yes.
And I find that so interesting, which is how the Silver Sisters mystery series came about.
Right.
It's because you both are so different.
Right.
She's more bohemian. You're more Beverly Hills.
And
and
we're the Silver Sisters.
Yes.
So and that's what you said. Even when
Yeah.
when your sister and we interview you, you really base these characters on yourselves.
Yes.
So there's not a lot of imagination to
Well,
that.
well, but I am not wealthy like Godiva. I don't live on an estate in Beverly Hills, although I did live 2 houses out of Beverly Hills at one time. And I'm definitely not as selfish as Godiva, but I do admit
Yeah.
that I'm manipulative.
Uh-huh.
Oh, you hear that, Al? All right.
My former business partner, when I had a barter and marketing and promotion company with a business partner, and he always used to say, you know, I come up with this idea, but I have no idea if it's my idea or
Or
if
your-
Morgan put it in my head.
Right, exactly. Well, we're running out of time, so we're
Okay,
down to the last
amazing.
minute of the show. And I'd like to thank our guests, Hal Morris and Morgan St. James, along with my co-host, Janet Corsi. Hal, where can we learn about your project now on the web?
Well, it's mostly about things that are not really covered heavily in the news. And for example, how many people know that after a 3-month test, that the Marines are withdrawing from keeping a company of women Marines out of a mixed platoon, a mixed group.
So where is this website, though? Is it Grumpy?
GrumpyEditor.com.
Okay. And Morgan, where can we find any information about your books?
You can find the most information about me at www.morganstjames, STJAMES-author.com. And that website has links to my various blogs. It has information about my books and information about moi.
All right. And you can find out more about our show. Just go to aspectsofwriting.com. On aspectsofwriting.com, you will find links to iHeart, iTunes. We're on Google now. We're also on Amazon on the AM/FM 24/7 network. Just ask Alexa for AM/FM 24/7, and then ask for Aspects of Writing. We're also on Roku TV and several other television outlets. And then we're on 14 terrestrial stations. So just go to aspectsofwriting.com and you'll find most of that information. In addition, we archive our show there. If you go to the bottom, you'll see a Spreaker little player there, and you'll see the shows are archived there. So until next week, this is your host, James Kelly, reminding you, if you can dream it, you can write it. Thank you again, Morgan. Thank you, Hal.
And thank
Thanks,
you for
Jack.
having me.
You're welcome.
Marvelous,
Thank you.
marvelous show.